Hola Sebastián, buenísimo de verte.
Igualmente, qué ganas de estar ahí. Perdón por no estar, lo intenté, pero todavía no pude. Pero bueno, ahora en marzo me dan la segunda dosis de AstraZeneca y ya voy a tener el esquema para poder viajar tranquilo.
Fantástico, fenómeno.
Sí.
Qué gustazo.
Igualmente, un gusto grande verlos a vos y a Carola.
Tenés que escribirnos un paper de primera, que solo Sebastián sabe escribir.
Un paper sobre este tema que voy a dar ahora, ¿no es cierto?
De primera.
Ok, perfecto. ¿Sí? Después me darás los detalles de los tiempos y todo eso.
Fuera dubito.
¿Cómo?
Fuera dubito.
Perfecto.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe you can go, because I can't tell. Yeah. Hello, welcome back, everyone. We are now going to go into the second part of our session on the pandemic and comparative perspective. We will be turning to the Southern Cone now, and we begin with Sebastián Lipina. ¿Qué tal, Sebastián? Un placer. Who is from the Consejo Nacional de Investigación, CONICET. And he will be giving a paper on the pandemic and children's psychosocial development in Latin America. Welcome, bienvenido. Momentito, just a moment. We're not hearing you.
Now you are hearing me, I'm sure, because I was on mute. I'm sorry.
Good
morning, Carola. Good morning, Carola. Good morning, Marcelo. Thank you for this invitation to you, to Professor Samagni and the other members of the Academy for the opportunity to be here and share this information. So I will share my presentation now, and I will stop my video just to be sure that the connectivity is, okay? Let me check that. Yes. So can you see my presentation now?
No, not yet.
Not yet? Oh. Okay. Let me check.
We'll let you know in the moment it appears. There it is.
Perfect. So let me check that all is okay. It is running. Coming.
We see the first slide.
Okay, perfect. All is right. Thank you. What I did to prepare this presentation was reviewing the literature on how the pandemic impacted child and adolescent psychosocial development in Latin America. In this context, I will refer to psychosocial in a broad way as different emotional, cognitive, and social processes involved in any developmental context, which children and adolescents use for adaptive purposes. For such a name, I have run several bibliographic searches in PubMed, EBSCO, Google Scholar, governmental and non-governmental and multilateral organizations website, an abstract presented at conferences on child and adolescent development between November 2021 and the first week of February 2022. As a result of this bibliographic research, I consulted 174 empirical papers, reports, and perspectives. The first thing that I verified was the little empirical material collected experimentally related to the impact of the pandemic on psychosocial development. With experimentally, I mean information based on the implementation of methods and techniques that developmental science usually uses to explore psychosocial processes. As in almost the entire world, scientific activity was also widely interrupted since the beginning of the pandemic. And in general, there were many difficulties in resuming field work until today, as well as in carrying out remote studies more specific than surveys. Some research groups began to make changes in their methodologies and to carry out virtual studies that are still under development. In any case, such kind of efforts did not occur to the same extent that in industrialized countries, such as, for example, USA or European countries. Based on the reviewing of the abstract of some of the main international conferences on child development, I could anticipate that new scientific literature on the topic will begin to appear during this year from some Latin American countries. This means that to date, there is no experimental published material of this type in Latin America, and that the information available comes mainly from reports made by government, NGOs, think tanks, and multilateral organizations, such as, for example, UNICEF, UNDP, ICLAC, and IDB, which is based on surveys conducted virtually or remotely. So it's important to consider that this information does not allow us to measure adequate prevalences or mechanisms. Most of the available information to date corresponds to the first year of the pandemic. In most cases, the impacts refer to the effects of the implementation of lockdowns, and in few countries, follow-up rounds are verified between 3 and 5 months after the start of confinement. I will give you some examples of that. The information on the effects of the pandemic on child psychosocial development in later stages of the pandemic, when vaccination and reopening of schools were verified, is still being collected or analyzed. In general, in Latin America, the implementation of studies of surveys applying longitudinal design is not frequent. Although there is available indirect information on such aspects collected by some observatories, the type of indicators that are used are approximations to such phenomena, but not direct information from children and adolescents on the performance or state of their psychological development. In summary, the available information that I will share now don't necessarily imply decreases or increases in cases, but rather the difficulties in the detection capacity as a consequence of the caregiver's perceptions under stress reports. Latin America has been a region characterized by high levels of socioeconomic inequity for decades. Actually, it's still considered the region with the highest income inequity in the world, in which the richest 10% own about 20% of the wealth. The progressive deterioration of socioeconomic factors before the pandemic significantly reduced social protection. Almost 50% of the economically active population gained its living in the informal sector with high gender gaps in labor participation. According to ICLAC UNICEF, the projection of monetary poverty for children and adolescents in the region in 2020 was 51%, and more than 65% of children lived in homes without access to social security. Until February 2020, the most critical threats to children were those derived from the crisis in climate, poverty, migration, malnutrition, lack of access to adequate housing, education, social protection, and the commercial marketing of harmful products. In other words, before the pandemic, the people in the region were not able to meet minimum health and human development standards, which already posed a risk to the development of children and adolescents, especially those who were in situations of vulnerability. A summary of the reviewed literature on impacts at the microsystemic level show us the following scenario. Loss of income in a range of 30 to 69%, increase of debts, job instability and informality, increase in governmental reception of cash transfers in a range of 26 to 59%, suspension in the purchase of reduction of food portions in a range of 30 to 60%, increased signs of anxiety and depression in caregivers in a range of 15 to 85%, gender violence and domestic burden on women, and reports of concern in caregivers regarding job demands, unemployment and job instability, decreased income, low emotional control in the face of uncertainty, fear of contagion and death, contagion on the return to schools in children and adolescents, self-regulation and behavioral problems in children and adolescents, especially in single-parent homes, organization of time and routines at home, and loss of learning opportunities. At the ontosystemic level, that is, at the individual level of children and adolescents, the scenario was the following. Sleep and feeding alterations, suspension of health controls in a range of 17 to 65%, suspension of immunizations in a range of 4 to 35%, increasing communication problems inside homes in a range of 7 to 34%, increased expression of anger and fights inside homes in a range of 15% to 59%, decreasing times and spaces for play, increasing scene exposure in a context of about 30 to 40% of lack of access to internet, mourning for death of a family member, an increase in signs of anxiety and depression in a range of 10 to 60%. Regarding changes in these signs throughout the pandemic stages, some reports show differences among countries and vulnerable groups. For example, in Colombia and Mexico, these values were maintained at the same levels after the end of the confinements in 2020. In Argentina, reductions of 17% in anxiety and 6% in depression were verified after the long confinement of 2020. And in Costa Rica, El Salvador, Colombia, and Peru, this type of incidence was greater in children who were victims of violence. As in other many regions in the world, even considering the limited available information in Latin America, the pandemic has disrupted the functioning of systems that support human well-being and development at many levels, from individual biology to families, healthcare, education, local and national governments, economies, and many other interconnected systems in profound and varying ways. So the pandemic represents a psychosocial systemic shock. Although the initial measures of physical distancing made it possible to contain the contagion, they also confined a large proportion of caregivers, children, and adolescents to their homes. Consequently, this increased children's exposure to parental job loss, income instability, and its effects on the dynamics of emotional interaction inside homes. In turn, this phenomenon made the distribution of tasks within the homes and the care of children more complex. In addition, childcare and educational programs have been disrupted, imposing challenges to parents and children's self-regulatory and learning development. This drastically limited the possibilities of teachers and other caregivers, not only to teach and to care, but to detect mental health issues and cases of violence, to provide contention and to advise to children. And of course, to activate primary and secondary prevention procedures. From a psychosocial perspective, perhaps one of the hallmarks of the pandemic has been the extent to which it has impacted the predictability of daily life. There is an extensive scientific literature showing that lack of predictability and control can have long-term effects on biological stress and immune system responses, two of the main mechanisms involved in emotional and cognitive self-regulation processing. In summary, also in Latin America, the pandemic can be conceptualized as a set of unanticipated and uncontrollable chronic stressors that are detrimental to the mental health of children, adolescents, and caregivers, particularly in those with disability, from migrant, refugee, cultural and ethnically diverse and socioeconomically deprived communities. In this sense, the generation COVID can be conceptualized as one exposed to an unprecedented exacerbation of psychosocial stressors, which impacts on mental health and well-being are expected to last years in the context of an insufficient planning and investment in mental health policies and services. Consequently, such a tsunami of psychosocial stressors may impact several self-regulatory competencies for coping with adaptation challenges in the immediate future. Any consideration of such a complex problem necessarily requires a relational perspective approach, which should involve a complex set of planning and actions to allow the identification of variable trajectories of psychosocial development, eventually expressed by different vulnerable groups exposed to known and new constellation of risks and opportunities, and consequently orient the corresponding and adequate intervention. To conclude, I would like to share some possible future directions that could be useful in facing the challenges that the pandemic imposes on the psychosocial development of children, adolescents, and caregivers of the generation COVID in Latin America. Regarding the conceptual understanding of the available information, although insufficient, it is possible to interpret it in a preliminary way from the pre-pandemic conceptual models based on a rich history of developmental theory and empirical research on ecological and family systems. However, the generation COVID imposes new challenges that could update and or modify previous theoretical proposals. Actually, the pandemic is teaching key lessons about how people respond to crisis and misinformation, and is promoting changes in the way scientists study public health questions. A full understanding of the impact of massive, everyday unpredictability over time will depend on the implementation of theoretical and analytical models that can capture, first, the multiple variable trajectories of different aspects of psychosocial development, second, at different levels of analysis, third, in different stages of development, and fourth, in different developmental contexts. Such capture of complexity necessarily requires updating methods of collection and analysis of the complexity of human development. In this sense, perhaps the generation COVID can be considered as a great opportunity to channel efforts that allow conceptual and methodological advances in the knowledge of psychosocial development in Latin America, and eventually in other regions, of course. At the moment, there is a need for research to address how mental health consequences for vulnerable groups can be mitigated under pandemic conditions. In more immediate stages, discovery, evaluation, and refinement of mechanistically driven interventions to address the psychological, social, and neuroscientific aspects of the pandemic are also required. Rising to this challenge will require integration across disciplines and sectors, and should be done together with the people of our communities, including children and adolescents. Information collection efforts require methodological reconsiderations in terms of sampling, selection of specific indicators of psychosocial development, and periodic measurements or assessments. Such innovations could benefit from the specific financing of intersectoral efforts that involve different observatories of human development, researchers from different disciplines related to child development that already carry out their activities in the region, as well as other stakeholders and policymakers working in Latin America. In particular, such efforts would be of great value for the exploration and identification of onto micro and macrosystemic impact mechanisms that could guide different upgradable intervention efforts. The continuous collection of information is a shortcoming in the region that requires specific financing planning. At the same time, that is a minimum requirement necessary to face the effects of the pandemic on mental health and emotional and cognitive development of the generation COVID in the short and long term. In addition, it is possible that during the development of the pandemic, other constellations of risks and resilience will emerge in caregivers, children, and adolescents of this generation COVID, which would require specific, different, and innovative solutions. Given the previous and current exposure to stressors that challenge the psychosocial development of children and adolescents, and the lack of adequate planning and investment in mental health policies and services in practically the entire region, one of the priority aspects is the provision of psychosocial care services and food security, which allow to prevent and treat mental health disorders such as depression, anxiety, and stress. Such immediate interventions should seek to also promote assertive and healthy parenting and communication practices between different social actors. In other words, innovation should include the concept of primary care in mental health that transcends the work in health centers, but any developmental context, including homes, schools, and neighborhoods. Although several countries have implemented portals and other information mechanisms, which are so important, they don't replace the provision of specific mental health interventions yet. It is possible that if conservative mindset will not prevail, this type of planning and actions will contribute to generating solutions to the effects of the pre-pandemic inequities on the emotional and cognitive development of children and adolescents. In this sense, multilateral efforts could consider the design of policies and investments in the context of the SDGs to help generate equity in access and mental health care and contribute to the psychosocial development. In such a context, the role of the academy in general, everywhere, must be oriented at least towards the support of continuous impact assessment, the generation of dynamic knowledge that can anticipate medium and long-term impacts, and to include the multiplicity of community voices in the research designs. Sorry, Carola, did you say something?
No, sorry.
Oh, okay, I am almost finishing. This requires also considering the development of algorithms that allow generating answers online. Instead, online is not, I don't mean with online through internet. Online is in live. instead of waiting for the completion of stages of the intervention. For all these efforts, the recommendations made by the WHO, UNICEF, Lancet commissioners in 2020, before the official beginning of the pandemic, remain valid. Put child health and well-being at the center of recovery plans, include experts on children issues in the relevant task forces and legislative working groups, engage ministries to work together for children, and ask children and adolescents what changes they would like to see. Finally, in my humble opinion, what is needed to face the challenges that the generation COVID presents us not only requires multilateral collaboration, innovation in financing and maintaining high quality clinical and research standards, but also, and probably most important, to base any effort on a moral, genuine premise of solidarity that can navigate the troubled waters of the pre-pandemic mechanisms of inequities that characterizes Latin America. Indeed, the generation COVID crisis is also an opportunity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sebastián, thank you so much for being so succinct and giving us actually 5 minutes and 42 seconds to ponder your wonderful presentation before we move on to the next one. Does anyone have a question? Kathy?
I'm just wondering how you're thinking about, and I like your phrase, the tsunami of psychosocial stressors. And this could be from a research perspective, and or in which case so many of these stressors are confounded, or from a policy perspective, like where do you begin when there's a tsunami of psychosocial stress? I'd love to hear more about that.
Thank you, Sebastián.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Kathy. Yes, I don't know, I am not a policymaker, but as a researcher, I can advise a policymaker to make a community of people, of scientists, of voices from the community to understand better, of course, policymakers and other stakeholders. And as for example, yesterday, story about the governor of Sao Paulo that Professor Reimers told us yesterday, the same. Gather people, bring people from different sectors and begin to talk about how to deal. What are the ideas from different sectors? So I don't think that with only science we will solve this kind of problem. So this is the first thing. Gather, bring people from different sectors. Then probably we need a plan, a good plan. So we need to first identify priorities. And the first priorities are to deal with, in this topic, to deal with the emergencies in mental health issues. So we need to check what is happening in the delivery of mental health services, online, in presence, in different places, because there are inequities and different problems and obstacles, structural obstacles in different cities inside, in different neighbors, inside cities, inside states, inside countries, and difference between countries. And then once the third stage would be to prepare, to learn and to prepare more plans for the immediate and long-term stages. So we can discuss about this a long time, Kathy, but the idea is gather people from different sectors, approach the emergencies based on the learnings of the experiences in these 2 long years in different places, and then make more plans for the future.
Thank you so much, Sebastián. And before I introduce our next speaker, I've been thinking that we've been talking a lot about the educational implications from this tsunami of psychosocial stressors. And but the other one we've touched upon the educational crisis and the mental health crisis, but we really haven't talked about what to do about the mental health crisis. And I think this is going to be the real challenge on the ground, because psychologists don't have a clue how to do what Pearl suggested we need to do, which is to get on the ground and use local models of, and you know, it's not the psychotherapist couch, and it's often not a teletherapy either. So we have a tsunami crisis of mental health, and I think it would be interesting for us to think together. Sebastián, I hope you will join us in that conversation. And lamentably, we need to move on to our next speaker, although actually not lamentably, or I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Gustavo Veliz, who is a policymaker and is the Secretary of Strategic Affairs with the Presidency of Argentina and a past academician, who will be talking about the pandemic in Latin America, regional perspectives, and maybe we can return to that, I think, very important question. Sebastián, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Gustavo, bienvenido.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. Thank you so much, Carola. It's a pleasure to be here. My best greetings from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I will talk about the problem in Latin America. And my presentation was named From the Generation of Fear of the Generation of Joy. The global health crisis causes a triple shock to children and youth around the world. In education, because of school closures, in emotional ties, because of long quarantines, and in economic security, because lower family income. The situation left the development of an entire generation at risk. In this context, we must ask which kind of public policies, as you have been mentioning, can help young people to rise from an unprecedented crisis. Although the pandemic struck all regions, Latin America and the Caribbean has been the most affected, with 18% of the world's infections and 30% of the world's health. Of the world's deaths, I'm sorry. Many families were unable to take preventive sanitation measures required for pandemic care. Poor living conditions, lack of running water, and overcrowding facilitate COVID transmission. Lower income countries are less effective in implementing health policies, such as social distancing, hand cleanliness, self-isolation, and use of masks. According to Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, 69% of the population in the region does not have safe sanitation services, and 26% does not have access to safe drinking water. The crisis hit the region's economies already weakened by years of poor growth, stagnation, and limited fiscal space for counter-cyclical policies. The virus does not discriminate between people based on income level, but poorer countries have an increased vulnerability. Public policies can and must contribute to overcome these difficulties, to build bridges of hope between fears and the joyful solidarity needed to restart better. In this context, I would like to talk today about two powerful words that the Church has us meditate on: fear and joy. About 5 fears that have grown with the pandemic and 5 joys that counterbalance them. First of all, fear of illness. The most immediate fear that comes with a pandemic is the fear to physical and mental illness of oneself or loved ones. Children and adolescents under 20 years of age account for 70% of reported cases of COVID globally. Despite accounting for 33% of the population, they represent less than 0.4% of fatalities. But beyond the low mortality rate, the pandemic jeopardized the mental health and the well-being of a generation. Disorders linked to loneliness, stress, anxiety, and depression emerge or deepened because of reduced social contact. Nearly 16 million teenagers suffer from a mental disorder in the region. 16 million teenagers. The consequences of social trauma are still uncertain. Childhood and adolescence are periods characterized by biological, cognitive, emotional, and social development, with a progressive adoption of roles and functions until the resources of adult life are acquired. Individual development involves the expansion of the walls of relationships outside the immediate family. In this regard, isolation is especially difficult for teenagers. Based on the cognitive and emotional resources that children and youth would contribute to economies if they were not affected and limited by mental health disorders. UNICEF estimated that the annual loss of human capital for Latin America at $30 billion. $30 billion. Technocratic cost-benefit calculation on investment in public policies to mitigate the impact of the pandemic do not always consider the significant loss of human capital. Joy and care. The fear to the deceased needs to be met with the joy of special care and dedication. By the close of 2021, more than 80% of COVID vaccines doses had been applied in high and middle-income countries. To safeguard physical health, it is essential to promote local capacity for vaccine production and distribution, with multilateral action to address intellectual property rights suspensions in extreme situations. Ensure mass and effective vaccination campaigns is the cornerstone of physical care. Complementary, it is necessary to place mental health among the priorities of public policies. Fostering a community of social care, promoting public, general, and open care programs for the healthy development of emotional ties. The so-called new normality occurred in a context of a strong increase in single-parent households, which in some countries exceeds 20% of the population. Without the schools, childcare often fell exclusively on the sole adult in charge of the household. Caregivers deserve special attention. Half of the caregivers say they feel sad, and about 2/3 are tired, fearful, or have insomnia. The situation is more serious among women, who mostly attend their children's distance education and communication with the school. Remote learning cannot be self-managed and needs adult care. The distress caused by the pandemic affected women more, and there was a gender gap that reached 26% in sadness. The worse the state of mental health of the caregivers, the less care the child receives. Rapid access to vaccines, public mental health programs, and initiatives that support caregivers are essential for a community of care that confronts the fears of disease. The second one is the fear of the educational gap in one of the most difficult stages of the pandemic. March 2020, when most countries were still trying to implement public policies in an unknown context, 1.6 billion students, this is 90% of the world's students, lived without face-to-face lessons. Schools were closed globally for an average of 43% of the time they should have been open in pre-pandemic times. Once again, Latin America and the Caribbean was the most affected region, with schools closing 80% of 2020. Several studies report the long-lasting effects of school closures, increasing school dropout rates. The situation is more evident in vulnerable and low-income countries, thus widening the inequality gaps in society. UNESCO estimated that the loss of human capital in the long term due to lower investment in education amounts to $1.6 trillion worldwide. The reopening of schools brought with it two additional problems. The re-engagement of children who were left out of the system during the time of virtual lessons, and the matching of skills for hybrid models. The situation in the region was already bad even before the pandemic. 51% of children under the age of 10 do not understand simple text. Comparing the performance of a group of students before and after the pandemic, there is a negative impact, with the loss being greater for children with low-educated parents and poorest families. The health crisis only widened an already high educational gap. Joy and knowledge. The reopening of schools needs to be done under strict safety protocols. When the percentage of the population with a full vaccination schedule is low, opening schools increases the number of adult victims, especially older adults. Nearly 10% of households with children under 14 years of age live with older adults aged 60 years or more. Contagion at school increases the risk of older adults living in the same house. We need to lay solid foundation for hybrid education, because the education of the future will have both face-to-face and distant components. These objectives requires the democratization of connectivity and access to the internet, and teacher training with new pedagogical skills. In Latin America, only 39% of primary schools have access to internet, only 39%. This value drops to 19% for rural schools. In some countries in the region, half of the people who access the internet do so only from their smartphones, because they do not have a connection at home. Investment in digital connectivity is an unresolved issue for closing educational gap. Currently, less than 60% of teachers have the necessary skills to integrate digital devices into teaching. Technological tools help to bring knowledge from smartphones, which are more widely used than the internet at home. These channels, such as applications or educational social networks, can serve to expand the scope of training for teachers and caregivers. Massive learning courses of computer programming is a complementary initiative to democratize access to knowledge. Reversing educational exclusion needs to be a public policy priority. The gradual and safe reopening of schools, the right use of new technologies, and expansion of technological schools can create a fast track to labor markets. Fear of the truth. The lack of exercise routines and the quarantine reduce physical activity for children and young people. Time spent in front of a screen increase, along with irregular sleep, less healthy diets, and lack of socialization. By spending more time connected to social networks and the internet, young people were more exposed to infodemia, a phenomenon that related to the pandemic but has grown hand in hand with virtual relationships. People are more exposed to disinformation, false or incorrect information created to manipulate facts with partial intentions. There is an increase in the tendencies to ignore evidence, to deny scientific discoveries, to translate cognitive biases into concrete behaviors that affect the environment and the life in society, the so-called post-truth. During the pandemic, false information about vaccination affected the health of people who, even though they could have been vaccinated, did not do so because of unfounded mistrust. Many were victims of false stories, conspiracy theories about the laboratories or the production of vaccines that undermined public health. Fake news spreads at a speed that can exceed real facts by up to 10 times. The hours young people spend in front of the screen and on social networks makes them especially vulnerable. This is why the anti-vaccine movement finds in many young people a breeding ground to spread resistance to vaccination. As a consequence of infodemia, feelings of anxiety, depression, and emotional exhaustion may also increase. Individual sorrow and social polarization are two sides of the same problem. Joy and attention. Behavioral science are crucial for recognizing effectiveness and calibrating public policies when governments navigate uncharted territory. Identifying behavioral biases and attention deficits is critical to create communication channels, to build consensus on social goals. Education and children and youth can create the habit of dismissing false news and reduce the damage they cause in public opinion, also slowing down their speed of circulation through social networks. Globally, 87% of citizens agree with providing educational content to identify fake news. But not everything can be done from the public sector. Large social media platforms must follow strict regulatory protocols, avoiding the spread of disinformation and create their own internal frameworks of ethics, transparency, and social responsibility to self-regulate. Algorithms that draw attention to any cost cannot reign over search engines. Otherwise, fast viral content could delegitimize institutions, generate distrust toward the other and toward the states, weakening citizen participation and reducing the quality of democracy. Digital media literacy is key for community life to prevent the spread of hate speeches and radicalization. Social peace requires a digital sovereignty of information that protects public debate and reduces verbal violence. In an ocean of data and noise, it is essential to teach young people to validate information sources, to distinguish what is true from what is only probable. Fear of hunger. The hunger epidemic has only worsened with the health crisis. Between 2020 and 2021, 100 million children have fallen into poverty worldwide. Around 20 million are in Latin America. The poverty rate among people up to 14 years of age tripled that 65 years old people and older. In the case of indigenous and Afro-descendant, poverty and extreme poverty rates are up to 3 times higher than in the rest of the population. In some countries, food insecurity rose from 40% before the pandemic to 56%. Many families have to reduce the number of daily meals due to income restrictions. Global infant mortality could increase for the first time in more than 60 years because of poor child nutrition and reduced access to health services. For vulnerable groups, the situation was more critical. Migrants suffered lack of access to health services in different geographies. Child abuse practices and human trafficking expanded because of a decrease in public policies interventions to limit these crimes. There was a sharp increase in drug use and overdose deaths, especially between March and May 2020, when fears around the pandemic were greatest. In addition to hunger, new forms of slavery expanded during the dual health and social crisis. Joy and solidarity. Solidarity expressed in concrete public initiative can be a powerful weapon against hunger. An example of this capacity is conditional cash transfers, which have reached a coverage of 33% of the population in Latin America and the Caribbean. Without the effect of transfers to children and other social protection measures, 51% of children and adolescents in Latin America will be in poverty. These programs cover 43% of households below the poverty line that have children. Both conditional and unconditional transfers improve the welfare of families and the access to health services for children. However, the crisis exposed structural problems in the region, including the fragmented and insufficient coverage of social protection systems. Many informal workers do not have access to social assistance. It is essential to avoid fragmentation of social initiatives and try aid not to disperse in government silos. We need to build bridges to convert social help into quality jobs that integrate families into the work and formal culture. These problems cannot be solved with invisible hands. Visible hands and strong political will are needed to bring them to the top of government and multilateral agendas. Social fear. The pandemic affected the poorest families the most. 70% of low socioeconomic households experience income losses, a percentage that reached 57% of middle income class. The crisis in the labor market had a greater impact on young people because they overrepresented in the industries and sectors hardest hit by the crisis and are more likely to work under temporary contracts, being more exposed to losing their jobs. The last in, first out principle applies to them, so they are often a source of headcount adjustment. Loss of jobs, income and long quarantines has led to an increase in domestic violence. Alcohol consumption also increased, and reports of domestic violence rose by as much as 50% in some countries in the region. Finally, joy and community. Public policy have a wide arsenal of options to strengthen community ties, create prevention mechanisms, and reduce domestic violence caused by unemployment. We must also address the consequences of technological unemployment. The jobs that are going to be replaced with digitalization need the creation of other quality jobs linked to new technologies. The care economy, green jobs such as recycling, resilient infrastructure, and reforestation or rural housing, among others. Economic recovery must be accompanied by first jobs plans for young people, recognizing social works in community and its importance for social cohesion. It is possible to redesign assistance mechanisms to turn them into a bridge between the current urgency and the shocks of the future. This will not be possible without a strong investment in public education, so that boys and girls acquire digital skills, while training soft skills which cannot be replaced by automation, such as creativity, innovation, empathy, communication, and teamwork. We can face the fear caused by violence with the joy of living in community, and arise the understanding about the importance of defend our common home. Respect inside and outside houses has similar roots. Working ecological knowledge about our planet is also a way to strengthen principles of coexistence in shared spaces. This is perhaps the main challenge of our time, to build a productive ecology with social harmony and lay the foundations for a regenerative economy of employment that strengthens family life, dignity, respect for others, and improve the quality of democracies.
Gustavo, if you can finish up in about 1 minute, please. Thank you.
Yes, I am finishing. Government were not prepared for the pandemic. 40% of the population said that the public policy response to the health crisis was deficient. Recognizing this fact cannot be an excuse, but rather the initial step to ensure it does not happen again, to improve our social support networks, to ensure the integral development of children beyond any circumstances. The fear of hunger, of disease, of the educational gap, of the truth need to be faced with public policies in nutrition, psycho-emotional assistance, the establishment of protection programs for the most vulnerable initiatives, to support family, to attend the mental health of children, young people, and caregivers. In our favor, we have to impulse of hope and optimism that lies in the majority of children and young people. It will be harder to ensure that the childhood of isolation leads to an adulthood of empathy and fraternity. As Pope Francis explains, in a world where there is just me, it is difficult to make room for us. Hope is the color of youth who gain resilience within adversity. There is no more important mission for public policy than to foster that dream. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Gustavo, for your presentation. And I would ask you to please stay online so that you can join us, as well as Sebastián, after the next presentation. We now turn to James and Kathleen Stone from the Stone Foundation, who will speak about resilience in the age of the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Chair, thank you all honored guests. My husband, Jim Stone, and I are honored to be here for what has been an inspiring and informative conference. Resilience has always been important at every level of human endeavor. The COVID-19 pandemic showcased resilience is needed even more than ever after an event which occurred in a faraway area of the world has had profound reverberations across the planet. And it illustrated that we are not well prepared for the challenges ahead. Back in 2017, Jim and I sponsored a conference entitled Ready Together, a conference on epidemic preparedness. The conference underscored the importance of preparedness, letting us know that we were nowhere near prepared. And as could have been predicted, the hardships and devastation of this pandemic has disproportionately affected the vulnerable in our world, those without access to health care, and those living in poverty. There's so much to be done to address the vulnerabilities COVID has exposed. We owe it to our children and our grandchildren to treat this time as a watershed moment to do more than merely return to our work. Philanthropy can help fill the gaps that governments overlook, but philanthropy and governments must see the pandemic preparedness about being much more than just public health. Environmental sustainability and economic inequality are two issues my husband and I are passionate about, and they are both critical to address as we prepare for future pandemics. Scientists have suggested that there is an undeniable link between climate change and an increase in potentially lethal viruses that jump from animals to humans. The destruction of habitat brings more animals into contact with one another and with humans. The more places vector-borne diseases can thrive, the more the opportunities for pathogens to spread from one host to another. The reduction of biodiversity can inhibit the resilience of the remaining species to fight against viral threats. Natural selection has provided plants and animals with many tools for disease resistance we have not even discovered yet and never will if we destroy their habitat. So what can we do? In his recent encyclical focused on care for our common home, His Holiness states, "The climate is a common good." This sentiment has underscored my life's work on behalf of the environment. His Holiness goes on to write, "Never have we so hurt and mistreated our common home as we have in the last 200 years. As the UN report from last August makes clear, human-induced climate change has reached catastrophic levels. We see it in rising seas, and we see it in intensified storms and melting glaciers. But as we bolster our resolve to fight climate change, we must also work to make people more resilient. Resilience means planning to live at higher sea levels with more storms, but it also means creating stability in the economic lives of people so they can weather life's inevitable challenges. This effort will require a collaboration the likes of which we've never seen. The world's governments, academics, nonprofits, and communities must come together in unprecedented ways. One effort currently underway in Boston is the Stone Living Lab, based on a partnership at UMass Boston under the leadership of the Chancellor, who has brought innovation and dynamism to the university. It seeks to make vulnerable coastal communities adaptive to climate change while enhancing natural and built environments. The lab brings together scientists, policymakers, government officials, educators, and community leaders. As a living lab, we bring the questions out of siloed halls of both academia and corporate R&D into the real world by creating a user-centered, open, innovative ecosystem that engages scientists and the community in collaborative design and exploration. The Stone Foundation is committed to establishing more living labs focused on building resilience across towns and ecosystems. In addition to bolstering the resilience of our coastlines, we see the protection of large landscapes as a key part of ensuring that today's youth will inherit a more resilient and ecologically stable world. Across the world, biodiversity is increasingly threatened by climate change. It is a widely accepted principle in the field of conservation biology that large connected landscapes and waterways are absolutely essential for biodiversity, especially when entire species are forced to migrate in search of suitable habitat. As one of our most brilliant and passionate scientists of our century, the late E.O. Wilson, said, unless humanity learns a great deal more about biodiversity and moves quickly to protect it, we will soon lose most of the species composing life on Earth. Future living labs will also learn to address how to make space for all species in the midst of modern life, including how to prepare for drastic changes to our water supply. Jim and I firmly believe that we need to leave a more equitable and resilient world for the next generation. And as His Holiness has written, we are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and one social, but rather one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring the dignity to the underprivileged, and at the same time, protecting nature. I would like now to introduce my husband, Jim, who will be saying a few more words about this complex crisis and the role philanthropy plays in solving it. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm honored to be included in this distinguished assembly and to associate myself with my wife's remarks.
That's nice.
Let me now add 2 points of emphasis related to my own personal experiences. I served for over a decade as a director and chairman of Management Sciences for Health, the nonprofit that Kathy referred to a few minutes ago. MSH is devoted to serving public health needs and preventing unnecessary deaths in some of the world's poorest countries. At the close of my service there, MSH employed 2,500 people in 40 countries with an annual budget of $300 million. Now, I commit a lot of my time to the philanthropy that good fortune in my business has permitted, concentrating on a single issue, the accelerating trend towards wealth inequality. Both activities are relevant, I think, to today's topic. MSH's chief executive in my time, John O. Quick, wrote a book called The End of Epidemics. Taken by his warning 20 years ago, Kathy and I sponsored the conference she mentioned. It was clear then that the world was unprepared for what was likely to happen. And now the coronavirus has brought tragedy, illness, isolation, anxiety, and increased xenophobia at a time when bridge building, diplomacy, and mutual respect are especially essential. In a world where vectors can be carried anywhere on the globe overnight, it is hard to envision that this plague and others yet unknown as disappearing. Our vaccines, antibiotics, and antivirals can be only a part of the defense. I run an insurance company, so preparatory risk mitigation is a familiar discipline in my world, but preparedness has been underemployed in global public health. It should be clear now that our public health culture, as well as institutions, must change to provide preparedness. Our country, my country, is in a particularly good position to protect itself and the rest of the world, and we have reason. We've lost more to COVID than in the 2 world wars in Vietnam combined. But I fear that history will judge American public sentiment as having been only half-heartedly committed to fighting the necessary battles. Too many Americans have somehow bought into the notion that whether to vax is just a personal choice. It's appropriate that members of a free populace can put themselves at personal risk if they don't harm others by doing so. It's hard to find a logic of ethics anywhere, however, to justify as a matter of solely personal choice putting innocents at risk of serious illness or monopolizing medical resources. Our cultural understanding of our duty to others must change. And this takes me to my last point, as one who began adulthood as an academic economist, I've long been interested in distributional equity. A standard high school lesson in my day proclaimed that our notion, the United States, was free of the inequity European hereditary aristocracies and ancient Oriental empires. It took me only a little learning about racial and gender disparities to see that nothing was quite that simple. The story's clearer now, but sadder. Distributional equity in the United States has not only failed to march towards improvement since then, it reversed course. Today, the United States leads its peer group in income and wealth inequality. Mobility has decreased as well. And when too much of the wealth is sequestered at the top, what mobility remains will be of diminished consequence. The top decile of Americans now own more than 90% of its financial assets. The top 1% of 1% have a combined net worth roughly equal to that of the lower 2/3. And we're not alone. The UK is right behind us on the same track. The rest of Europe may be a lap behind. And ironically, Russia and China are running about neck and neck with us. If I had more time today, I might explore with you the causes of this trajectory. On my list would be the expansion of technology, globalization, the financialization of our economies, and numerous examples of pernicious public policies. Now, I carry no brief, let me say, for absolute leveling within nations, as the biologist E.O. Wilson that Kathy referred to earlier put it. Great idea, wrong species. But Europe in the Dark Ages demonstrated what comes of the opposite corner solution, where the monarch and the princes own everything. That solution's even easier to reject, since it gave Europe centuries of starvation, illiteracy, and stagnation. The challenge is to identify the spot between the poles where the balance is optimized for the benefit of the whole society. But the greatest threat of extreme inequality may be to democracy. It should be obvious that a degree of economic pluralism is a precondition of democracy. As equality erodes our pluralism, we increase citizen alienation with the process, enhancing the power of single-issue voters, of haters, and of the simply delusional. This is a landscape that favors the bearers of heroic promises that have so often preceded catastrophe. By John Rawls' notion, a just society is one in which virtually all would sign off on its distributional pattern before knowing where on the ladder they would find themselves. Few, if any, nations can beat John Rawls' standard today. The most obvious connection to this COVID is the access to vaccinations and treatments. Another is something you can see by looking at who got richer and who got poorer during this COVID crisis. And a third, less well discussed, a third linkage arises when a lack of distributive justice stresses the middle class, as is very much the case today. Where middle classes prosper, their prosperity tends to nurture a generous cast of mind towards the less fortunate, both within borders and toward the world at large. As the rich get richer, the poor have nothing to give up. So it's the middle classes that lose out, and the society tends to lose its generosity towards its own poor and its sense of duty to the world. That's why Kathy and I are sponsoring academic progress towards understanding the causes and consequences of wealth inequality. The longer this COVID virus multiplies and mutates anywhere on the planet, the more variants we will have to fight. For the sake of all, my country ought to be the leader in protecting the rest of the world, and especially in Earth's poorer countries. But were the best angels of human nature to somehow prevail, China, Russia, and the United States, with support from a few others, would override national pride ignore the serious issues between them, and unite to cooperate in the production and distribution of data, vaccines, necessary supplies, and treatment medications. This current threat, after all, does not derive in the manner of war from hostilities between nations. Its source is a relentlessly hostile, inhuman adversary. Surely the nations of Earth would all cooperate. You can imagine this if a threat came from some fiendish invaders in flying saucers. Are those spiky helmeted little virons really different from enemy space aliens? I'm confident that our amazing science and the passage of time will inevitably defeat this plague, but relief would surely be swifter and resilience enhanced if we balanced healthy competition with international collaboration. A propitious reassessment of our global connectedness would speed the world's return to health and normalcy and open the gates to a host of longer-term benefits from communicating with mutual respect on other common issues among nations as a bonus. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. You gave us a lot to think about, and I think all three of these papers underline the importance of systemic and interdisciplinary approaches to both preparation and a response to the kinds of crises that the COVID pandemic has presented to us. So I would like to open it up now for half an hour of conversation and questions and discussion. Please.
He's first.
You were at my please, Ashid, and then you.
Thank you. To Kathy and Jim, just fresh, obviously, on my mind as you have laid out a sort of a beautiful vision of solidarity and of countries working together. And yet, and that's something that many of us early in the pandemic called for, a much more global response to a global pandemic. And yet what we have seen is vaccine nationalism, promised doses getting shut off, people hoarding, people really fighting against trying to cut bigger and bigger slices of a smaller and smaller pie. So the question for you, but really for everybody, is do we just assume that in future health crises, this is how countries are going to behave and everybody should plan accordingly? Or is there an approach that says, no, one can be realistic to hope that we can act better next time? I realize that's an impossibly hard question, but I just want to put it on the table.
I'll take a quick crack at that. If you want to add to it afterwards, you can. I think natural selection has made human beings a complex mix of competitive and cooperative, and you never know which one is going to prevail in any situation. So I can still hope that the one that didn't particularly prevail this time can prevail next time. And it's just a hope.
Well, and I have the hope or expectation that at the international level, some new rules and procedures can come out of this and to become one of the silver linings. And institutions, you need institutional support. I wouldn't wait for everybody to act perfectly without a little nudge. Next.
Thank you. I have a question for both Kathleen and for James. Thank you very much for your presentation, which I liked it very much. To Kathleen, I'm sure that you read or happen to know about the book published in 2019 by Darren Walker. He's the president of the Ford Foundation. The title of the book is revealing. The title is From Generosity to Justice. I read it 3 times because I couldn't believe to my eyes, because that was written by the president of one of the major American foundations. In that book, he says, philanthropy might be eventually dangerous. Why? Because philanthropy tends to cure or taking care of the wounds without considering the causes of the wound. And so he suggested that it does not mean that foundations should disappear, but he claims that the world of foundations, together with other non-profit organizations, they should contribute much more than they do in the policy making, jointly with the institution. Because if they are treated only as executor of decisions taken, the danger is. On the other hand, to James' question, you correctly mentioned preparedness. As you know, it was in the Washington Conference in 1989 when Stephen Morse introduced the distinction between preparedness and readiness. That is a point which we keep on forgetting. To get prepared means that the country should get prepared to face future perverse events, like a coronavirus, the COVID, etc. But preparedness is not enough. You need to have a system which is ready. Because in this case, I don't know, I have no information about America, but I know Europe quite well. We were prepared, but not ready. And so, for instance, we had the mask, but to get the mask to the people took 3 months. Now, that is the case of Italy. We have a bureaucracy, which is what everybody knows. But even in France and in Germany, it's limited. So the point is, because readiness cannot be guaranteed by the, let's say, formal institutions. They are good in providing preparedness, for instance, to buy it. But readiness presupposes the intervention of civil society organizations, such as a volunteer association, such as social enterprises, etc. Because otherwise, ultimately, that means that we have to take seriously the principle of subsidiarity. Thank you.
I think that the role of philanthropy is overdue for a serious inquiry. I believe that there's enormous assets there, but it has yet to form a block of influence in decision-making such that it is included in the preparation of policy and strategy, and that it will all be more effective. For example, one problem of philanthropy is it can be used to separate communities. It can be used to bypass communities, and certainly bypass the least among us, but brought into the decision-making process as a partner of policymaking has yet to be really articulated. So I think we need a new narrative. And Jeff and I were talking a little bit about this in the break. So as you're exploring your many inquiries, you should continue a thread, not to say, how would this sector respond? How should it respond? And how do we hold it accountable to community?
Let me add a little to that. I agree with that. And let me say that philanthropy really can only be a supplementary or second best kind of solution. It's the very nature of philanthropy is that it's elitist. And so when I say that our great interest is in greater wealth equality, part of that is that, as I tried to say in my talk, that allows the whole society to be more generous. But the trend is the other way. And so right now, money is flowing to the top, much more than I think is healthy. But therefore, the role of philanthropy becomes very important because that's where the money is. And so it's not a really desirable answer that we depend on philanthropy to make public policy, but it's better than not having it at all until we can correct the more fundamental problem, which unfortunately is moving the other way right now.
And thank you for both.
Yeah.
And I've been sitting here thinking that when it's a question of life or death, you're going to see selfish behavior at the individual level and certainly at the country level, unless there are other incentives in place. So did the World Health Organization play much of a role in the pandemic? And to what extent were they successful? And did the United Nations play much of a role? And to what extent were they successful? I think there might be some hopeful messages. You're nodding. And how do we, I guess, empower them to be even more successful the next time? But would you like to start, Ash?
Let me just quickly say to your question, Kathy. I mean, WHO played a very big role, and they certainly tried to play a very big role, but there were roadblocks, and the roadblocks were WHO is a multilateral organization that has limits to its power. And so it has a bully pulpit, it has a lot of other abilities. It pushed hard on global vaccinations, and countries that had vaccines said, yep, that sounds great, we'll keep it for ourselves, thank you very much. And WHO didn't have any mechanism to push countries beyond that. And again, I don't think WHO was perfect, and we can talk about places where it could have done better, but fundamentally, if a nation, whether it's the US or India or anybody else, decides we're not going to send vaccines out that we're producing, it's very hard. And that vaccine nationalism, and I don't mean to pick on US and India, I mean, a lot of European countries are the same.
Jeff, then Gunia, then Melissa.
Yeah, let me say a few words about diplomacy. Diplomacy can work because there are actually just a few key actors that have a disproportionate possibility to forge solutions. The United States, China, Russia, European Union, and a few others. It's not a lot of actors in the room to reach constructive outcomes. This did not happen in this pandemic. It did not happen in the lead up to the Ukraine war. It has not happened vis-a-vis the US and China and so forth. It's dramatic, the failure of these few actors to talk. I see it quite close up in many cases, and I blame the United States to a very large extent, actually. I'll give you an anecdote. We need a discussion among the main vaccine producers so that the mechanism of COVAX and WHO could function. To my knowledge, there has not been a meeting of senior US, Chinese, Russian, Indian, EU officials at UK because of AstraZeneca to discuss the practical allocation of the monthly production. To this day, I asked one of the top US officials about this. The answer was extraordinary. And this is the state of our world. Well, we had a meeting. We invited the Chinese, but they turned it down because we also invited the Taiwanese. This is imbecilic, to tell you the truth. At that meeting, the role of Taiwan was zero. The idea that that was the important thing for the White House was domestic politics. It had nothing to do with the pandemic. It destroyed what little chance there was for a discussion. I'll give you another example. At the beginning of the Biden administration, the order was given for several months, no discussion with Chinese counterparts. That was an all-of-government mandate. Several of us have very high-level contacts in China on many things, in my case, on the economic sphere, among top technocrats. And I have top contacts with people in the administration. They could not speak with people that they had spoken with for 20, 30, 40 years. Why? Because We lose when we discuss with China was one of the ideas. We had the strategic dialogue. That doesn't work. We need to get tough, whatever it is. I'll use the same word, imbecilic. How can countries maintain peace in this kind of approach? It's impossible. For months, actually it's years in the lead up to this disaster in Ukraine, the Russian government has said that they have deep security concerns over the expansion of NATO. The United States has never allowed this to be a topic of discussion between the countries. In fact, we mock it. We say it's ridiculous. Why should they care about this peace-loving defensive group? And we can't understand anything of what's happening. So we're failing in the most basic diplomacy. That's why institutions like WHO can't function. They can't function when the leading powers don't even talk. And this is what's happening in the world. If you read our press in the last few days, it's beyond the worst. You can't find out anything really going on anything. Everything self-congratulatory. Today, Krugman has a completely foolish column. Russia's a Potemkin economy. It's all ridiculous. He gives false numbers, by the way. I don't know if he understands the numbers that he cited, but they're wrong or deeply misleading. But the whole idea is insult, it's ridiculous, Russia's failed, this is 4 days into a disaster. And now all the triumph of how our sanctions have worked. And we're talking about a country with 6,000 nuclear warheads, and there's a lot to come. We're a little crazy right now in our inability to have discussions with others. That is what is happening. And that's why the Pope's encyclical is so profound and essential, Fratelli Tutti, because it's about one thing: talk with respect to the other side. That is a program of peaceful engagement. So Jim's exactly right. Of course we could cooperate. And one of the most interesting facts, and I'll just finish here, of all of the experimental game theory is a very, very basic idea. Okay? You give the prisoner's dilemma experiment. If you give it to economics students, they all cheat. That's the first point, because they learn in class that the only rational thing to do is to defect. It's literally true. If you give it to nursing students, they almost all cooperate because they can't even imagine what is the point of this game. If you give it to normal people, you get about half cooperation. Then the fascinating thing is, if you allow people to talk beforehand, the game theory predicts that has no effect. That's what economists call cheap talk. It doesn't bind you, you can say anything, then you play the real thing. So what all of our game theorist experts who are international relations, strategic planners, RAND analysts say, well, there's no point in talking. But if you do this experimentally, you get the most phenomenal point. Cheap talk, quote unquote, leads to nearly 100% cooperation reliably. You let two people talk, they figure out the prisoner's dilemma. They solve it by cooperating. Talking is really a wonderful idea. That's my conclusion.
It's a wonderful conclusion. Dialogue.
Yes, there are some exceptions, even within economics. There are some exceptions to what you said within economics, fortunately.
But dialogue, a duty to others, collaboration, these are all things that we need to be nurturing in education. Let's begin with that, but across diplomacy. And if we don't find ways to interrupt the status quo, and I have a feeling my partner to my left is about to skip the line.
This is the difference between
Gunisha and Stefania, Melissa and Stefania. Okay,
sorry.
Very quick.
1 second. 1 second. That's the difference between a Swiss and an Argentine.
Yeah. 45 years.
1 second. Jeff, the other side of Fratelli Tutti is listening.
And, well, that's.
Now, this is going to be quite a trick. I was on fiscal policy and not diplomacy. But you found the linkage back to the fiscal policy from the diplomacy by talking about cheap talk, cooperation, talking, and dialogue. Because I wanted to circle back to the issue of what can philanthropy actually do in terms of public spending. And I wanted to focus on what we have done without going into any details of what we've done at Innocenti in terms of looking at the social spending on children during COVID, obviously before and hopefully also after. I wanted to find, when you're talking about pernicious public policies, what can philanthropy actually do when you have a focus on distributional equity? And to me, that's an opportunity for equality of opportunity for all children, to look at the child-responsive fiscal policies and public services and benefits to children in both low, middle, and high-income countries. The role that philanthropy, which focuses on these important issues of inequalities and equality of opportunity for children, can actually do to help leverage that into the social spending for children and in terms of fiscal policy and other issues, which are very, very important, both during a pandemic and obviously for society altogether. Thank you.
For philanthropy is to look at what the problems are and then try to be innovative in a way that's too early in the system for an institution to take over. For example, one of the interesting observations, I think, from the meeting today is how do we capture the problem solving that occurred at the local level? And that innovation is important to understand in terms of preparation and training. Well, that might be an example of the kind of inquiry that philanthropy can begin, and if it finds enough data that they can go ahead and become part of public policy. So I see it as innovators and picking up threads that have not been exhausted. There's also, I suppose, a role, if there's a more integrated approach, is to working with say a school system to find out, well, what were our particular needs, for example, in Boston? And are there any needs that could be contained or improved by the resources that we may be able to identify? So it may not be of much interest, but whenever I have something that I'm looking at, I'll often invite other foundation presidents and professionals to come to lunch at my house and to find out what they think about it, to see if they have any background. So it's the yeast. If it's one role is the yeast. And I'll defer to my husband.
in this hybrid space, I just want to invite them either to jump in and comment if they have comments, and remind you all, if you have questions, to bring them in the spirit of inclusivity. Melissa, and then Stefania. Oh, and Gustavo, and okay, so Gustavo has his hand up. So Melissa, Stefania, and then Gustavo.
Thank you. I would like to make a few remarks from the other, from the bottom of the pyramid, let's put it that way. This is not the US, China, UNESCO, WHO. This is, I'm speaking as one of thousands and thousands of NGOs who are on the ground struggling for survival. And when we have the kind of confrontation that Jeff is describing, we have to work it out. We don't have a choice. We can't withdraw into our power block, so to speak, and survive. We're pressured by all of our colleagues to negotiate. And I could do a 3 to 4 hour workshop on my experience in the last 25 years of the agony of being forced into a corner and having to talk about extremely contentious policies, understanding of the facts, analysis, and of course, what to do. So I would like to, like some others have said today, thank Pearl for her comments about the critical point of understanding the local context. I feel that's terribly important. And sometimes I've thought that I should back off from my work in our own NGO and spend my time trying to raise funds, because I network like a maniac, which is how I learn everything. Spend my time trying to support NGOs that are doing the brilliant cutting edge thing. And that leads to my second remark, which is one of the funders of our NGO has told me that she now spends a significant amount of time educating philanthropists. This is a challenge for many of us NGOs. How do we educate donors and philanthropists? We can't, people like myself are not permitted by the gatekeepers to talk to Gates, Ford, and the other big foundation. The gatekeepers have incredible power to keep those of us who might be a little contentious on current views of, in my case, prostitution and trafficking. So how do we educate donors and philanthropists? This is a very serious concern for many of us in the NGO world. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. Very important points. Stefania, and then we'll close with Gustavo.
Very much. Well, listen, at the end of this really inspiring morning session, unfortunately, it's the last one for me because I have to move at the end of this session itself. I mean, I feel even more optimistic than the beginning. I already shared with you the sense of hope that comes from being on the front line somehow, not only, from Paris perspective, but also on the ground. 2 years in this pandemic, of course, in our fields of competencies. But I mean, connecting or trying to connect all the dots of these brilliant presentations this morning and yesterday as well, I think there is a clear evidence that we are moving in the right direction for what? For researching for and maybe finding out our culture, educational, social vaccines. That's what we have to take from this crisis. And why I feel a bit more optimistic, because there is a common understanding about the impact, the huge impact of this tsunami of psychosocial pressure, quoting from Sebastián, with short-term and long-term consequences. We know a little bit more about the first ones, including immigrants and all the most vulnerable, hardest hit. We know a little less still about the long-term consequences, but we know for sure that this impact obliged all of us to find a shift of paradigm, a really dramatic change. And there are some concrete proposals that we heard also this morning in terms of new measures. I love very much, and I would like maybe Sebastián to ask Sebastián to elaborate a little bit more on his proposal about innovation in grants, really taking an interdisciplinary approach in terms of investment and translating these measures in policies. So from the policies perspective, I see also, maybe not yet, Jeff, a clear action plan, but we have the methodology to follow up and to see how we can really have it. And I also see a clear picture in terms of the cultural change we need, just building on the brilliant point made by Stefano before. We have the opportunity to build a new kind of concept of citizenship today, which is about solidarity versus individualism, which is about cooperation versus competition, which is about inclusion, of course, versus exclusion, and which is about universalism versus globalization, which are not two sides of the same coin, but two different kind of understanding of what's happening around us. So how can we translate concretely this year? Listen, I see two big opportunities thanks to big events, or maybe initiatives more than events for sure, and the great convening power of two great personalities we have on our side. One is Pope Francis and the Global Compact for Education, which is focusing on education, but listen, is very much broader and beyond that. If you read the statement and the text and the content of this ambitious call for action, is about really calling the community of educators and political leaders to translate in a culture of listening and talking, just to put it simply, the action plan for the coming months and years. And we also have the Secretary General of the UN Transforming Education Summit initiative. Still, it's about education, maybe not by chance, because we see that education can really play this role of cross-cutting policy and sector to bring all together the dimensions, protecting biodiversity and taking care of the planet and the environment, which is a part of the agenda, which is not a responsibility of educators or ministers of education, but a real shared responsibility with the government. So I really would like, I don't know, Mr. Chair, which is the outcome of these workshops. 2 years ago now, it was a beautiful book which is coming out, but it could be great to have the ambition to contribute at least to this big initiative, which can be the catalyst of the way we can find our social, culture, and educational vaccines to be proposed to governments and communities. So thank you very much, really.
Stefania, thank you so much for these beautiful culminating comments that are inspiring. I would I absolutely want to, Gustavo, I couldn't see your hand. I apologize for that. I would very much like to have you close us up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carola. I'd like to emphasize 3 or 4 ideas about the current situation. I feel that the world has been changing for worse since the last week. Beyond all the roots of this war problem and beyond all the different causes that provoke this violent situation, I am not optimistic about the future, unfortunately. We are going into a geopolitical recession and the multilateral system is under fire. I am afraid of having a new seminar in this coming month about the pandemic of war. I am looking at the very dangerous trends since the last week: arms race, food insecurity, energy crisis, climate change worsening all over the world, inflation, the weakening of democracy, technological apartheid that is provoked by the war, and the increasing of vaccine nationalism. We are discussing about the probability of the possibility of using atomic arms, and this is under discussion right now. So I feel that this is a completely different world that we have the last week when this seminar has been organized, and I am fearing that will be provoking and worsening the mental health problems, the health problems, and the whole situation that our countries are facing with regards of the COVID-19. This is not a situation that could be overcome in a very easy way. And the seriousness of this situation is a regression for the whole world beyond all the causes that has been provoking this very sad moment. So more than ever, the words of our Pope Francis calling for peace, for cooperation, for fraternity are the main important way that we have had to consider in these very difficult times.
Gustavo, I could not. Gustavo, you make very important points. I think Jeff would be at the same end of the spectrum in pessimism that you, and I think we all are trying to walk a delicate line between pessimism, optimism, and realism. When Marcelo conceived this meeting, we thought we were coming to the end of a pandemic. We didn't conceive that we were about to go into a war. So we always are looking for what lessons are learned from a moment. Where are we going to move forward? What can we do in the future? And then how do we respond? So I think we must do so with great soberness. I thank you all. I want to thank Sebastián, Gustavo, Jim, and Kathy, all for your wisdom, all of you for allowing us to go over a few minutes. I apologize, I was not a good Swiss. But the conversation was too deep to be interrupted for something as trivial as lunch. So I thank all of you, and we look forward to rejoining soon. Thank you. Thank you.
Recording stopped. can I ask you whether we can have a quick group photo? Because, for instance, Professor Giannini is leaving now, so to have most of us are here. So if you could just step outside the front door here and have it on the steps, so it's quick.
But
Thank
only
you.
if we